Well, it's been a quiet week in Washington, D.C., out there on the edge of the country. Halloween happened this past week, that day that comes once each year when the youngest of us can dress scary and the older of us can dress sexy. And neither of them is fooling anyone, but we don't say anything because they need this. They need it. It's been months since kids experienced the sugar rush of Easter, and years since the sexy nurse or sexy evangelical preacher or sexy incarcerated immigrant looked remotely like sex or any other three-letter word. So, we give it to them. Halloween is about more than simply being frightening, of course, because in a town like Washington, D.C., people see the truly terrifying every day. Such as a week ago when all those bombs were mailed out of Florida. It wasn't Florida that surprised or frightened everyone because "we probably did that" is actually their state motto.
Florida. Yeah, we probably did that.
It wasn't even the bomber who mailed them. Nobody was shocked by that because that's what bombers with no transportation but a broken down van that displays all of their deep political paraphernalia do, after all. It's in their job description. It was the way our leaders, or representatives, or elected psychopaths, call them what you will, it was the way Republican politicians around our nation turned on the victims. It was the speed with which our nation watched the Republican Party as a whole take a minute to shrug before immediately turning their disemboweling knives on those who evaded Floridian bombs. I'm not saying America hasn't had years of practice being let down by the Republicans, but it did come as something of a shock, even if it shouldn't have. Because Halloween, after all, is a day for being something you aren't. More than that, it's about being somebody nobody has ever encountered. And a Republican with a sense of loyalty towards other Americans or the nation itself is something we really haven't seen in decades. Sherry Finn didn't have time to consider those bombs and bombers. Halloween had always meant something very different to her, and she often spent it dressed in very little at any number of parties with such minimal garments, which she often referred to as a costume, though she always did so in a very small font, growing smaller and smaller with every party and every drink. But this year was very different. To start with, she finally had to admit that people in their 40s, and at 42, she figured she was officially now in her 40s, were more likely to stay home alone than wake up in the home of another person, usually one she didn't know, and who she hoped had recently showered and could make coffee. Anyway, she knew she had to face reality. She knew she didn't have a choice. And she knew all of this care of her new responsibility, Sean. 2 days before the fateful holiday, Sean was yelling over breakfast that Sherry still hadn't bought him a Halloween costume. He would yell with every finished bite, which is not to say he did not yell with his mouth full, but only that he ate so fast he could really only yell after he came up for air. And Sherry was just fine with that because she was too busy thinking of all her possible replies. Why hadn't she bought Sean a costume? Probably because she now found herself in a job that required her to work 12-hour days most days, and 7 days a week, every week. Every week. Sherry had dreams about weekends she had once spent in bed. Granted, they were waking dreams, but they were as good as any Sherry would see. Maybe she hadn't bought him a costume because When she did consider it, she was stuck on the phone with her bartender, Bob, who was cornered by Brett Kavanaugh because he didn't have a beer ready for the supreme Lee infantile justice at 8 a.m. The bar wasn't opened at 8 a.m., and Sherry did not want to think about how Brett Kavanaugh had found Bob's apartment. But there went her chance to buy Sean a costume. And finally, Sherry fumed as Sean spat the devastating remnants of his Honey Nut Cheerios her way. Maybe she hadn't bought Sean a costume because she wasn't his mother. And he was 13, for crying out loud. When she was his age, Sherry had already been living out of the house most of the time. Why couldn't Sean? Why wasn't he out? Why was Sherry being punished? And when her right shoulder was hit by the flat side of a flying Cheerio, which stuck to the polyester fabric of her blouse, that right there was pretty much it. Sean had been living with Sherry for months before they found out that he was basically staying with her from now on, and that now that her sister was dead, nothing was ever going to be the same again. She had told herself many times that she was going to have a talk with Sean. In all honesty, their living conditions had kind of slipped together the way old leftovers in a single bowl might congeal into some new kind of food. And running a bar took everything Sherry had. She couldn't possibly manage a 13-year-old boy. A 13-year-old boy, by the way, who might have been on some spectrum of some kind, or who might have just been a normal teenaged boy. Which is to say, a nightmare. But she was going to have to do it. It was either that or get used to wearing food. And Sherry wasn't quite there. Not yet. Sitting at the small table in the kitchen of their apartment, a long room, almost a hallway of sorts that connected the rest of the living quarters to the outside world through a narrow sliding door that opened to their third-floor patio. Sherry sat in arm's reach of Sean and played out the satisfying way the flat of her left hand would connect to the boy's face over and over, before taking the back of her right hand and moving Sean's cereal bowl with a wide sweep of her arm. The bowl ended up so close to the edge of the table, she might have knocked it off completely, if it wasn't for the fact that she would have to clean it up. "Okay," she said. "That's it. We need to talk." Sean made that teenage boy sound of annoyance, a kind of, I can't do it, but it comes out of the top of the mouth and the sinuses, a kind of chuff that passes out of every air passage simultaneously to establish dominance. Sherry said, "I never asked for this, and neither did you, but guess what? Here we are. Things have changed. And I can be angry about that change, or I can accept it and learn to live with it." Sean muttered something under his breath, no different from any other teenaged boy, Sherry was sure, except that Sherry thought she heard it. And working at her bar, Freedom Fried, best fries inside the Beltway, she had heard comments very similar from men far older than Sean and just as mature. She could have let it go, probably should have let it go. But she didn't. "Say that again," she told her nephew. Something about his comments had very much to do with the idea of change and acceptance. But it wasn't what Sherry had been talking about. And like that chuffing sound he made, it may not have even been in the words. His words were that tattered cloak of the rabid magician, which I will grant you is something we don't see very often, but you know that feeling deep in your gut when someone is lying to you without saying anything that is technically untrue. Don't you? It's that same tone the traitors use when they say that Trump was the true victim of the Pittsburgh shootings, that the bombs hurt him the most. It's the kind of lie a talented magician can make look true with just the right spin. And it was that cynical spin in Sean's words that had Sherry so, well, it made her downright angry. Weren't they on the same team? Wasn't he living in the same house? Wouldn't any downfall affect him just as profoundly? But Halloween isn't the day when we are ourselves. Halloween is about being something nobody has ever encountered, such as a 13-year-old boy with a keen political eye, or a party girl who blew through her youth and her possibilities, who had to be a grown-up right about now. Or a Republican who sided with America. Or a social malcontent who wasn't a middle-aged white male. It's when the crazies come out. We kind of hope they'll go away the day after. Many of us have started decorating with Day of the Dead masks the next day to kind of give the crazies a hint. But they never take it. They slump back to their gerrymandered churches and families and ready themselves for any caravan of migrants or refugees they can spit on and throw in cages. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Only works in this century with an evil laugh running underneath. And so Sherry told Sean to buy his own damn costume. She didn't have time for it. There were probably a lot of apps Sean could download onto his phone with costume ideas and no, not the apps Sean used most of the time, which Sherry wanted no knowledge of except that his parents had signed up for a service that sent reports about exactly what Sean was looking at on his phone. Reports that now Sherry was receiving. She dreads those reports that come in that she doesn't remember signing up for. But they come in every day. She gets a reminder on her phone while she's at the bar, and instead of mixing the Whiskey Rebellion, which is a variation on the Manhattan, she's lost before she can pour as she reads this list that reads like war crimes from another century. She reads statistics of various sexual deviancies she's sure someone in her parents' generation would have gone to prison for. Rape fantasies, and slapping, and choking. And she had to ask Bob about that one. Bob! A man who is only supposed to mix drinks and nothing more, which is why she hired the half-literate California refugee. But now she has to ask Bob about choking. And he tells her that it's considered a normal sexual activity, so that now she's no longer worried about her nephew. She's worried about herself. How is it she didn't know that? Is it because she's old? Is she old now? She wanted to tell Sean that Halloween is a holiday when we pretend to be something nobody has ever encountered, such as a teenager who isn't sex-crazed, who listens, maybe just a little, who understands that the tragedies of life are ones we all share, we all experience. And we're here to help each other. I hope Sean figures that out soon. I hope Sherry does too. I hope we all do. We're all just a bit too shell-shocked as a nation. It doesn't matter which shell shocked you or which shell you shocked. You're just as shocked and have just as much a right to be shocked. But we're not here to be shocked. We're not alive just so we can be angry. We're here to help each other. We're alive to live. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is what it says on the parchment. It doesn't mention anything about getting mine. And that's the news from Washington, D.C., where all the women are wrong, all the men are crooked, and all the children are screwed. This is Ken LaSalle, and I just wanted to thank you for stopping by for this episode of DC Home. For more information about myself and the work I do, I invite you to take a look at my website at kenlasalle.com. You can also find my work on Amazon, Audible, iTunes, and anywhere you find books and audiobooks available online. You can also find me on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube by searching my name, Ken LaSalle. And thank you, as always, for your support.